Good morning, this is Damon Fordham, and this is the class of May the 28th, 2020. Now, before we even get started with this, I'm going to let you know that I'm going to move up the next test number 3 to next week. Instead of June the 1st, it'll be the following Monday, the Monday after that, because I think we need a little bit more room to talk about some other things before we get into that particular test. Now, having said that, we're going to talk today about the Assyrian Empire, and this is basically the second phase of what was happening in ancient Babylon. And your main text, of course, talks about this beginning on chapter 4, page 121. And it begins by talking about a king who will be a main focus of our discussion, a fellow by the name of Sennacherib, and I'm sure I'm butchering that, but hey, you do the best that you can phonetically with this kind of thing. But anyway, he says that, it begins by saying that he was the ruler of the Assyrian Empire in the 7th century, and we're going to talk more about all that in a minute, about how he wrote that at the end of one successful campaign he took 200,150 people, great and small, male and female, horses, mules, donkeys, camels, and sheep without number. And the captives who resisted were dragged back to Assyria and forced to labor into his expanding, magnificent capital, Nineveh, and toiled on the immense irrigation works to open up new agricultural frontiers. And that was kind of unusual for this point because, see, that was a great deal of stolen goods. So how did he get that way? Well, you have to understand what happened in the ancient Babylonian into the early Assyrian Empire. Now, as we discussed earlier, an empire is a group of people, usually of different ethnicities and different states who've been conquered all into one. And what happened with earlier Babylon, about 1200 BC or so, was that you had a considerable period of climate change and drought. And this forced out a lot of nomadic tribes to migrate considerably. But also during the drought period, you have social upheaval because people are then starving, and thus, of course, that causes a lot of disarray and rebellions and that sort of thing. So that was pretty much a lot of violent migrations, and that sometimes these nomads, as many of you know, are people who travel from one place to the other without a permanent home, they often prey on each other. And I mean P-R-E-Y as in prey. Okay? So there's all this going on, but then of course necessity becomes the mother of invention. They began to use a lot of pack camels. And of course, camels can carry water for long periods of time as well as other things to travel and such. And then you begin to see the extreme levels of shipbuilding, to where you see the first use of what we could call battleships. Now, of course, they don't have guns or anything like that at this point, but they have, like if you ever watch a lot of old movies, a lot of tons of oarmen rowing and people sending out all sorts of fiery archery and that kind of thing. And of course, this leads on to a lot of innovation and such. So thus you have people conquering at large degrees. Then, along with this, you have this empire that rises from about 911 to about 612 BC. Okay? And you begin to get a whole lot of advantages. They began to develop military tactics such as a cavalry, which are basically people who ride horses and shoot arrows and all of that in order to perform their army and such. As well as, of course, they have a large deployment of infantry, and they're doing pretty good with warships. They also use the people who they conquer as slave labor to build up their empire. And they began to add this whole aspect of religious propaganda. To give you an example of this, it's discussed on page 130 of your text. They had a god by the name of Ashur. And the idea was that in order to prevent from floods or natural disasters or defeats or anything like that. They told the people that they had to go to war and keep conquering to keep this god Asher happy. And as long as the god was kept happy, the people would continue to win battles and things of this sort. And so thus, this convinced the people that in order that obedience to the king in warfare and conquering would be the voice of God. So let's take a look at some of the people who were involved in this particular time period. Okay? Now, Nineveh, incidentally, is mentioned in the Bible, as a matter of fact, in the book of Kings, particularly the book of 2 Kings 17 and 2 Kings 19. Okay? So a lot of biblical things sort of correspond with this. So with the shipbuilding and the use of iron and military techniques and camels and so forth and this propaganda and such, here's what you see happening. There was a king called Sargon II, who was not to be confused with the Sargon that we talked about a couple of classes ago. This Sargon II was king from 721 BC to 705 BC, and he was killed driving out a rival tribe, and he was succeeded by Sennacherib, who also is mentioned in both the Bible and ancient records, as we shall see. Okay. Now, this Sennacherib, who I'm going to talk about in detail in a few, was killed in 681 BC. And after ruling Babylon for some years, it was taken over by the Assyrians. So Sennacherib opened up the canals around the city, which flooded Babylon and destroyed the city. And it is said that his sons killed him. There's a biblical account that also alludes to this, which we, of course, will talk about soon. And he had a son called Esarhaddon, who became king. And he took over Assyria and rebuilt Babylon from the flooding. He tried to conquer nearby Phoenicia, which was under then Egyptian rule. And so Egypt, by the way, was ruled by a Nubian king named Taharka, who, of course, is also mentioned in the Bible in Isaiah 24, 10th chapter, 4th verse, by the way. Okay, and you could look that up along to sort of buttress this account. But anyway, this Taharka, so incidentally, this Esarhaddon took back the country around 673 AB and sent Taharka back to Nubia. All right, and like I said, I'm going to share that with y'all a little bit later on. So this coincides with the Babylonian Chronicles. When Esarhaddon died in 669 BC, he had a son named Ashurbanipal, who took over and he dominated Egypt and installed a puppet king. However, while installing the puppet king, he crushed the Babylonian revolt. But he did something really great. He decided to keep a library of cuneiform tablets, and he promoted arts and culture. But when he died, civil wars broke out, and weak leaders who were unable to hold it together. So thus that empire fell around 609 BC. By the 500s BC, Babylonia and Assyria had become a part of the Persian Empire, which we'll talk about in a future class. So pretty soon, the cuneiform writing died out. Why? Because at this point, the elites were the main ones who could read the cuneiform. And they were destroyed in raids. So thus the cuneiform language would eventually die out. However, there was a Frenchman by the name of Eugene Bornoff in 1836. And he began the first successful deciphering of this language. And then in 1835, there was Henry Rawlinson. He founded what is known, and I know I'm definitely butchering the pronunciation of this, called the Histuan inscriptions, Persian, 1835. He was with the British East Indian Army. And he came across an inscription in rock relief in western Iran, aka Persia, of the events after the death of Cyrus the Great, and an autobiography of King Darius, who will be discussed in a future class. So, this was written in Old Persian cuneiform and in the Elamite language in Babylonian. And this Henry Rawlinson could read two of those languages, and yeah, sounds familiar, right? Almost exactly like the story as to how hieroglyphics were discovered. And it was because of that that we're now able to understand such things as Hammurabi, as well as Gilgamesh, and the account that I'm talking about today. Now, in the midst of all of this, if you check your books on this, your books talk about these inscriptions on page 134 and 135. And the excerpt that you have has a detailed description of King Darius. More about him in a minute. Now, also while this is happening, you began to see the rise of a new religion. And the new religion was called Zoroastrianism. Okay? Now, the prophet Zoroaster lived around 1000 BC, and he formed a new religion. He was opposed to polytheism and animal and human sacrifices and so forth, and it started in East Persia, and it spread to the whole Persian Empire, especially after the king of Persia was conquered. So the essence of his teaching was this, that he received a revelation from the one true God, who he called Ahura Mazda, right? Who was the Lord of Light. And this was the God of truth and righteousness, whose enemy was Ahriman, who was also known as the Prince of Darkness. Essentially, this was the version, sound familiar, right? Well, this is essentially their version of God and Satan. Now, I should say that the Hebrews by this point were already doing their own thing, which we now call the Jewish religion. But anyway, these two deities battled over what we would now call the soul of man. Ahura Mazda gave man the choice between good and evil, and Ahriman tried to trick man towards evil. And through man's choices, he was either rewarded for following Ahura Mazda or punished for following Ahriman. Ah, sounds very familiar, right? Yeah, pretty close to what we would now worship, dealing with the Hebrew as well as Christian faiths. But back to this Sennacherib, there's a document that was called the Prism of Sennacherib, which I'm going to provide a link to, where he says this: Sennacherib, the great king, the mighty king, the king of the world, the king of Assyria, the king of the four quarters, the wise shepherd, favorite of the gods, guardian of light, lover of justice, who lends support, who comes to the aid of the destitute, who performs pious acts, perfect hero, mighty man, first upon all princes, the powerful one who consumes the insubmissive, who strikes the wicked with the thunderbolt, the god Assur, the great mountain, an unrivaled kinship entrusted to me. Above all who dwell in palaces, he is made powerful my weapons from the upper sea to the sunning sun of the lower rising sun. He has brought the black-headed people in submission to my feet, and mighty kings feared my warfare, leaving their homes and flying alone like the Sedina, the bird of the cave, in some inaccessible place. Basically, he's basically putting the idea that he's all big and mighty and everything in order to get people to submit to his will. In other words, this is an early use of what we now know as propaganda. So basically with this, you see a lot of what's to come in place. And if you have your Worlds Together, Worlds Apart reader, what I just read to you about Sennacherib was being the Prism of Sennacherib, which goes in your text from page 120 to about 126. And I'm going to provide a link to that along with this. And also, regarding this Zoroaster, we're going to talk more about him in the next class, but you're going to hear about him in your text from page 141 to 144, as far as your Worlds Together, Worlds Apart book. And let me share you very briefly about some of his teachings with that. He says, in essence, that, now I will speak, O proselytes, of what you may bring to the attention to even one who knows. He says, hear with your ears the best message. Behold with lucid mind the two choices and decision. Each man makes for his own person. Before the great supplication as he look ahead to the declaration of him. They are the two walls, the twins who in the beginning made themselves heard through dreaming. These two kinds of thought, of speech, of deed, the better and the evil. and between them the well-doers discriminate rightly, but ill-doers do not. In other words, free will. Okay? All right, so basically, again, I'm going to provide links to this, and your test is going to be moved up a week, so we're going to talk a little bit more about Zoroaster and all of this in our next class, and then we're going to deal with the issue of Cyrus the Great and Darius the First. And I will see you on June the 1st.